Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to work with some of the options on the pivot table and pivot chart contextual tabs. Now I've opened up the Learning Files workbook and I've already built a pivot table and a pivot chart from the Technology Equipment Inventory spreadsheet. This is the same pivot table and pivot chart that I built in the last video, the video called Building Pivot Tables and Pivot Charts. Now, when you have a pivot table or a pivot chart and you activate it by clicking on it, if you look up where your tabs are, you'll notice a couple of new tabs. Right now, my pivot table is activated. So I have the pivot table analyze and pivot table design contextual tabs. If my pivot chart is activated, I have pivot chart analyze, design, and format contextual tabs. We're going to work with each of these. I'm going to start with the pivot table analyze tab. So on this tab, you find various options for analyzing your data in the pivot table. I'm going to show you how to use the most common options, not all of them, because this is a basic class and I just want to show you how to be effective and proficient with a pivot table. So working from the left to the right, we have our pivot table group. And this is where we can name the table. So I can take out the default name and put in what I'd like. So I'm going to name this inventory, tech inventory. Next to that, I have the active field group. This is important. If you look above the field settings, it says sum of quantity. This refers to how my data is being calculated in the pivot table. So I have quantity in stock as my value. So that means that the quantity of stock data is being added, sum of quantity in stock. So in Boston, we took all my bags from my spreadsheet and added them up. And it said that there were 66 of them. Okay, in Chicago, we added up all the bags in Chicago, and there are 454. Now, if I didn't want my data to add, if I wanted it to do some other type of calculation, I could change that by clicking on my field settings button. That opens up this field settings window. And this bottom half is where I choose how I want my data to calculate. So I'm going to change it from sum to count. So now this isn't telling me that I have one bag in Boston and 3 in Chicago. What this is saying is that I had 1 shipment of bags in Boston and 3 shipments of bags in Chicago, and so on. Okay, if that doesn't work for me, I can click my field settings and choose another way to calculate my data. I'm going to go back to sum. Now, another way that you can change how your data is calculated is from your values drop arrow. If you click on value field settings, that opens up the same window that we just saw over here. Okay, so there's 2 ways you can access the same data. Now moving over, I want to jump to the filter group. Insert slicer. So a slicer is just another type of a filter. I'm going to click on that. Now, my slicer categories are the same as my pivot table fields or my column headings in my original spreadsheet. To insert a slicer, I just check off the slicer that I want to see, and I can do one or I could do a couple. I can do as many as I want. I'll do one for technology category and one for current location. These are my slicers. I'm going to move them out. And here's how they work. You point and click. Okay, so if I want to see LCD projectors, I click on them. Both my chart and my table filter according to what I specified in my slicer. If I want to filter by more than one category, I can hold down my control key and click on a few different other categories. And my data updates. If I want to clear what I filtered by, I can click this clear filter button and all my data comes back. So this is just another quick, easy way to filter out your data. Now notice when my slicer is selected, I have a new contextual tab called Slicer. We'll look at that in a little bit. I want to go back to my pivot table and back on my Analyze tab and look at a couple of the other options. Now in the data section, I have this refresh drop arrow. So refresh all will refresh my pivot table and my pivot chart. Refresh is just going to refresh whatever's activated. So in this case, it's my pivot table. Now, what this does is it updates your data from your original spreadsheet. So let's say something changed in my original spreadsheet. All right, let's change the number of bags that I have in Boston. Let's remember this number 66. Okay, so I'm going to go to my original spreadsheet and I'm going to find an occurrence of where I had bags shipped to Boston. Here's one. Okay, in row 24, I can see I have bags in Boston is 66. All right, let me change that to 500. Now I've entered my data in my spreadsheet. If I go back to my pivot table and pivot chart, it still says 66, right? 66 bags. And then if I look over here for my Boston, it's way down here with 66. Now, in order for my pivot table and my pivot chart to update, I need to refresh my data. So that's where I go to the Analyze tab and I click the refresh drop arrow. I'm going to refresh all because I want it to update on both my pivot table and my pivot chart. So when I clicked that button, that value changed to 500 and I can see the bar that represents bags jumped up over here and it also is at 500. Okay, so it's important to note that data in a pivot table and a pivot chart does not update automatically. You need to refresh your data on the Analyze tab to make that happen. Now, your clear options. Clear all is going to get rid of all the data in your pivot table and your pivot chart. Clear filters is going to remove any filters that are applied. So if you've applied multiple filters, whether it's through a slicer or a filter tool in a pivot table or on the pivot chart. Okay, no matter how you filtered out your data, if you want to clear everything, you go to the Analyze tab and clear filters. Okay, that'll clear all your filters at once and bring back all your data. This pivot chart button will create a pivot chart for you if you didn't have one already created. So if I just had a pivot table, I could build a pivot chart just by clicking on this button, and it's going to build the chart based off of my pivot table. Okay. Let's look at the Design tab. Now, the Design tab is simple. All this tab does is provide me options for how I want to look at my pivot table. Okay, so subtotals, I can choose whether I want to show them or not and where I want to put them. Grand totals, same thing. I can choose if I want to see them and where I want them to go. Report layout just lets me see my pivot table in different ways. Pivot table style options. So this is if I want different formatting applied to my row headers. I check that off. Didn't really make any change here. Or column headers. There was a little change there. Banded rows. Okay, and banded columns. So it's just different options for how you want to look at your data. And then you can apply a style to your pivot table with a point and click. Okay, you have categories, light, medium, and dark. And you just choose something you like. Now let's look at the options for your pivot chart. And I'm just going to make the chart a little bigger, a lot bigger actually, so that we can see the options better. Now I'm on the Pivot Chart Analyze tab. Everything is pretty much the same as the Pivot Table Analyze tab. So everything we could do on that tab, we can do on this one. The only thing that's grayed out is your active field. So if you wanted to change your pivot table field settings, you have to do that from the Pivot Table Analyze tab instead of the Pivot Chart Analyze tab. Working with slicers, same thing. The slicer's connected to both the pivot table and the pivot chart, so it doesn't matter where you grab it from. Okay, it's going to work the same way for both tools. I'm going to go back to the chart and the Analyze tab. Okay, so all the other buttons are the same. Now the Design tab is the exact same tab that you see when you design a regular chart. Okay, you've already seen all the options on this. Okay, so if you want to add chart elements, they work the same way. Add chart element. I'll do a data label. I'm going to do more options because I don't want it to be busy. I'll also add grid lines. I'll do it like that. If I want to change my colors, point and click, find a color set that you like, apply styles. Okay, these are all the same options that you've already learned, and they work the exact same way. You want to change the chart type, make sure you pick a chart type that will represent your data well. We know columns and bars are interchangeable, so I'll change it to that. I might have to make it a little wider so it's more readable. Okay, and the Format tab also works the same way. Okay, so on the Format tab, you have to pay attention to what's selected on your chart. So if I wanted to format the legend, I would select it and then apply whatever formatting options I want. Okay, if I want to format the side wall, choose it, and then choose the formatting options that you want. Okay, so hopefully you can see the benefits of using pivot tables and pivot charts. And knowing how to use these basic pivot table and pivot chart tools will enable you to analyze your data so much more effectively. Let's take a second and just look at the Slicer contextual tab. So I'm going to click on any slicer and activate my Slicer Tools contextual tab. This is one of the easiest contextual tabs you'll ever use because all it does is deal with how the slicer looks. I'm just going to scroll up so you can see the whole thing. So you can give it a different name if you want from this window. You can apply a style from this window, point and click. You can make your buttons and your columns and rows bigger and smaller just by playing with these buttons. Okay, I usually like to use the sizing handles rather than the button options. I just think it's easier, but you should be aware that you have them. So if you want to work with a particular slicer, click on it and then work from your Slicer Tools contextual tab. All right, so I think you guys should have a good feel for how pivot tables and pivot charts work. And you now know how to use some of the basic tools on your contextual tabs for both pivot tables and pivot charts.